From Kona to Yenan, the political memoirs of Koji Ariyoshi. Chapter 5, Relocation to Manzanar. In the spring of 1942, when 110,000 of us, all of Japanese ancestry, were put behind barbed wire and watchtowers, we were not charged with any overt act or crime against the United States. Hysteria had been whipped up against us by the press and radio. A whole people of common ancestry were labeled subversive, dangerous, or potentially dangerous. The majority of us were American-born, educated in public schools. What meaning did American birth, education, upbringing, and experiences have in time of war and the whipped-up war hysteria? Actually, the 200% super patriots showed how little regard they have for the teachings, cultures, and traditions of this land, which shape people's minds. After all the years of living in this country, people of Japanese ancestry were to the West Coast racists just Japs and nothing more. This was the period when the leaders of our government could have set an example for the whole world and given true meaning to the war against imperialist aggressors and their superior race myth. The American people could have learned lessons in democratic processes by the government's firm stand in face of pressures and hysteria, and by informing the populace who the people of Japanese ancestry in the United States and Hawaii were, and how they differed from the Japanese militarists and war financiers. We could have taken the wind out of the Japanese propaganda of Asia for the Asiatics. But our country, which denies 15 million Negroes equality and holds Indians in custody on reservations, had a long way to go before carrying on such a healthy program to mobilize the people. Civil rights cannot be fully enjoyed by one minority and be denied to others. All the people must believe in and live by them. On the other hand, such education as mentioned above would wipe away Jim Crow and the ward system among Indians, and those who forced the evacuation did not want this to happen. Evacuation was a great setback for civil rights. Prior to my leaving San Francisco, I frequently met with a group of Nisei in the Montgomery Street workshop of sculptor Isami Noguchi. We discussed the coming evacuation and speculated on the kind of life we would be permitted to live. One night Larry Tajiri, now editor of the Pacific Citizen and one of the ablest Nisei newspapermen, came with a news release from General J. L. DeWitt's Western Defense Command headquarters. The information said that DeWitt would evacuate Japanese aliens, American citizens of Japanese ancestry, German aliens, and Italian aliens, in this order. Citizens before enemy aliens. This question came to my mind and I believe to the others. We began making preparations for evacuation. Some moved far inland, beyond the jurisdiction of the Western Defense Command. Tajiri went to Salt Lake City to edit the Pacific Citizen for the Japanese American Citizens League, JSCL. This was one of the very fortunate things that happened to the Issei, immigrants born in Japan, and the Nisei, for Tajiri made the weekly an influential voice that elicited support nationally for people of Japanese ancestry, and the Pacific Citizen published outside the relocation centers, gave voice to grievances of evacuees in the camps, kept the evacuees informed of occurrences in the various centers, and generally helped to give them perspective. I moved from San Francisco to Los Angeles, and there I found the alien Japanese dreading and fearing the FBI. Those I talked to did not know for what reason they might be arrested. Most of them had been affiliated with some Japanese organizations, church or community groups. Many of these organizations are still on the Attorney General's subversive list, and not long ago some Japanese aliens were having trouble with the Immigration Service just because they had once belonged to now defunct associations. In Los Angeles, as in San Francisco, I saw family heirlooms going up in smoke. Photographs, letters, particularly those from relatives in Japan, books and periodicals were burned in haste. Kodaks and cameras were broken or given away. Fear had infected our people. Some second-generation community leaders were being accused as FBI informers who were turning in names of disloyal elements at $25 per head and for personal protection. This allegation was fantastic, but it divided the Japanese community by instilling fear and distrust for one another. Propaganda of the racists and vested interests and dramatized arrests by the FBI in early 1942 made the Nisei and their alien parents appear more and more dangerous. Nisei were losing jobs. Japanese-owned businesses suffered. Families lost their life savings, part of which they are still trying to collect today in the face of government stalling. And cold hostility of the uninformed but propagandized public developed. By the time the order for evacuation came, there were many who felt that it was safer for them to go into inland relocation centers. At this time, white persons visited the Issei and Nisei homes to buy their belongings. One morning I heard a visitor offer $15 for a brand new $250 refrigerator. The Japanese couple finally sold for $25. Another family sold a 50-gallon drum of oil for $2. Everything was sold for a song, for the white people knew the Issei and Nisei would have to dispose of their property in a hurry, and they drove a hard bargain. In the meantime, the army was instructing us to get rid of all excess baggage in a hurry. I remember the day I went to register to go to the Manzanar Relocation Center. The man at the desk told me I could take only one duffel bag or two small bags, whichever I could handle by myself. Where can we store our furniture and other personal property? I asked for an old alien couple. Get rid of them, there are lots of junk buyers, the man answered. Doesn't the army or government provide warehouses? Not that I know of. When I told this to the old couple, they quietly shed tears and remarked about the callous treatment of human beings. I helped them store their belongings in a church. Months later, when we were far inland, we were informed that vandals had broken into the storehouse and taken the valuables. For later evacuees, the army and the government provided storage places, but by then the frenzied people had disposed of their belongings, accumulated over a long period of years, for practically nothing. To the man in charge of the evacuation, General DeWitt, a Jap's a Jap. They are a dangerous element, whether loyal or not. There is no way to determine their loyalty. It makes no difference whether he is an American citizen. Theoretically, he is still a Japanese and you can't change him. You can't change him by giving him a piece of paper. General DeWitt expressed this and other views before the House Naval Affairs Subcommittee in San Francisco much later. We read in the anti-Oriental Hearst Los Angeles Examiner that about 20 beauty parlors and fancy barber shops with manicurists were being planned or Manzanar. Manzanar would be a modern city with stores and shops to satisfy our needs. We were going to be paid union wages, the army press releases said. One of the first photographs to come out of Manzanar was rather interesting. I saw it in a Los Angeles newspaper. A few Nisei girls smiled as though the world was theirs in a barracks room with a photograph of General MacArthur pinned on the wall behind them. I later learned from one of the girls, who were early volunteers, that a news photographer had gone to Manzanar with MacArthur's photograph under his arm. He tacked it on a wall and asked the girls to relax and smile. They were played up as loyal elements who were taking evacuation without bitterness or anger, but with an adventurous spirit. One of my friends received a letter from his friend who had gone to Manzanar in the first contingent. Don't rush to come here, the letter said. When the first 83 volunteers arrived in the most inhospitable, isolated desert land, 4 barracks were taking shape. They ate dry sandwiches at mealtime. The first night they huddled against each other because there were no window panes, no roof over their heads either. It was extremely cold, with a strong, cutting wind blowing down from a nearby snow-capped mountain range. The plank lumber walls were full of holes and cracks. Dust and sand swept by with the strong wind. The army had a white construction crew of 400 men to build Manzanar in 90 days, a community of 1 square mile in area, to house 10,000 of us. 1,000 evacuees were to move in 7 days after construction began. Naturally, hardships resulted. On April 2, 1942, I too joined a contingent to Manzanar that rode on a train with cars that seemed to have been dragged out of antiquity. I took a last look at Los Angeles, people waving, white friends of evacuees wiping their eyes as the train pulled away. All day we traveled northward and saw black lava, glittering white alkali lake beds, desert stretches, oases, and bronzed, parched mountain ranges. At nightfall we arrived at a town near Manzanar where we transferred to a bus. The cold wind howled outside, and as we approached the new clearing amidst the sagebrush that was Manzanar, sand and dust pelted the bus windows. At the gate the bus stopped. A military sentry was there. As the bus entered the barbed wire enclosure, I looked back into the darkness, on the road we had come. Out there, beyond the barbed wire, was the world we knew. We cannot go back now, a friend said. We are locked up. The night of April 2, 1942, when our bus entered the barbed wire compound, I wondered when we would get out of Manzanar Relocation Center. I wondered whether people outside who believed in civil rights would raise their voices and fight for us. One of my friends who had studied in Japan told me that we might be shipped to Japan after the war. His wife, who was to give birth to the first child born in Manzanar, listened quietly, showing all the signs of exhaustion after the 13-hour trip from Los Angeles. My longshoreman friend from San Francisco, Carl Yonda, was already at Manzanar, having arrived there in an earlier contingent. He greeted us and helped us stuff our mattress sacks with straw. We registered at an office and were given numbers. Then we walked to the tar-papered barracks assigned us. I was thrilled by the sight of people working together, strangers thrown together. The early volunteers helped new arrivals to get settled. No one could miss the spontaneous unity of feeling, the common struggle of displaced persons to make a go of this existence. For the moment we were all alike, the rich and the poor, talented and untalented, strong and weak. I thought that as we build this community on this dry, forsaken land, we would find grooves to fit into. We would discover new interests and nurture hopes of passing through the gate in the barbed wire fence on our way out of this imprisonment. I walked into the small barracks room covered with dust, with wind whistling in from between the rafters and the walls and from the wide cracks in the flooring. 4 old bachelors walked in with their straw-filled mattresses. We introduced ourselves. "Where are you from?" One of them asked me in Japanese. "From Hawaii, originally," I answered. "You have a home then? At least a place to go back to someday," he said with an encouraging smile. "But your home is far away." "For the time being, this is home for us," I said. Line 2. The old fellow half closed his eyes, shook his head sideways and said softly, as though he were talking to himself, "I've lost everything I had. We'll make out all right." "We all will," I tried to encourage him. We walked out into the darkness and my longshore friend yelled, "Watch out for the ditches. A guy broke his arm the other night." When I opened my barracks door shortly after dawn the following morning, I saw in front of me a gigantic harsh granite wall which soared into the sky a few miles to the west of our concentration camp. This was the Sierra Nevada range, stretching north and south for miles and miles. What a chilling image. It looked dark and foreboding, like a giant bat with wings outstretched, watching us from aloft. I had never imagined I would see the highest mountain in the United States under such circumstances. To the south of us was Mount Whitney, 500 feet high. Much closer, about 10 air miles away, stood Mount Williamson, almost as high. The grandeur of these lofty summits did not fascinate me as I had once thought they would. In my grade school in Kona I had studied about them from beautifully colored illustrations and descriptive words in geography books. I had a tourist's view then. But at Manzanar, the Sierra Nevada range was a natural barricade for us outside the barbed wire compound. Early in the afternoon, the mountain range cast shadows over Manzanar, shadows that brought with them depressing feelings to hundreds of people. To the east of us rose the tawny, rolling Inyo and White Mountain ranges, running parallel with the lofty Sierra Nevadas. Owens Valley was a narrow strip between these two ranges, and our Manzanar was a point in this arid, semi-desert, bronze, sage-covered plain. Far to the north was Reno, the city of quick divorces, and south of us was Los Angeles, from whence we came. As I stood looking at the granite giant from the doorway, I heard a woman in the next room praying to Buddha. How like my mother, I thought. With all the cracks and openings in the wall that ended halfway to the roof and had no ceiling to give privacy to occupants, I could hear the prayer very clearly. The woman prayed for her health, her family's well-being, and for everyone in camp. Later on in the day, her daughter told me that her mother should not pray, for the FBI might arrest her. And the mother told me that she had prayed as long as she could remember and deeply regretted that fear of government reprisal had forced her to burn her Buddha and the tablets of the family dead. One of my roommates woke me up as I was sitting in the doorway and asked, "Who do you think will try to escape from here?" "I think no one here thinks of that," I replied. From where I sat I could see the eastern and western ends of Manzanar. Military guards patrolled outside the barbed wire fence, and high watch towers were going up, equipped with searchlights whose powerful beams were to play over the camp at night, disturbing our peaceful slumber. A few days after we arrived in Manzanar, an administrative officer talked to those of us who lived in Block 10. He asked us not to complain but to cooperate, to be model evacuees so that the government would not make it tough on us. He said the newspapers had whipped up sentiment against us, and that we were in no position to roam the country at large. He said that the watchtowers and barbed wire fences were put up for our own protection from angry Americans. In the late spring the wind blew vehemently, frequently at supper time when we stood in long queues. Dust moved like a thick brown wall at 40 to 50 miles an hour, so thick that we could not see the line of barracks across from ours. The rooms were constantly filled with dust and there was no use in cleaning. Mothers carefully covered their infants' heads with blankets, and hurried into mess halls where people lined between tables and twisting. Endless queues, waiting their turn to be served. We could not see anything outside the windows but brown dust, which blew into the mess hall and formed a brownish scum over milk for babies and over our food like pepper. People hurried through their meals. The morale was high for people who had suffered so much, sustained great losses in crops they had left behind, farms and property they had lost. We all got together to combat harsh physical elements of cold, wind, and dust. We had almost no time to brood. The novelty of communal living took time and effort for adjustment. But all this was a temporary condition and we faced difficulties ahead. One morning, Elaine, Black Yonda, the wife of my longshore friend from San Francisco, came storming into our tar-papered barracks. I asked her what was the matter. She said she had just seen Assistant Administrator Kidwell and had asked him to partition the women's toilet. "The young girls are so bashful," Elaine complained, and told us about mothers who brought curious little boys into the women's washrooms. "Are the partitions going up?" I asked her. Kidwell said the Army made the specifications for the buildings, she explained, and partitions were not provided for. But he said he would see what could be done. Soon after this incident, newer washrooms had partitions put up. Those in already established blocks were installed later. This pleased Elaine immensely, although by her standards her contribution was small. But these little things, small improvements here and there, made the camp more livable. Elaine kept calling the camp administration's attention to such matters. In such a way this Jewish woman won the hearts of countless alien Japanese and Nisei who were prejudiced against Elaine's people because of incessant anti-Semitic propaganda they had been exposed to. She had a double count against her in a community where so many of the people, held behind barbed wire, harbored bitterness against the white people, a category into which Elaine fell. Manzanar had a great need for a woman like Elaine. She put to use effectively all the training and experience she had acquired in the labor and civil rights fields. She had been district secretary and national vice president of the International Labor Defense League, IDL, from 1931 to 1941. This organization, which she had led on the West Coast, had come to the aid of Filipino workers in Maui when, in 1937, the Vibora Luvuminda, an organization of Filipino workers, struck the Pu'unene plantation. It made a vital contribution in preventing the Vibora Luvuminda strike from being crushed through the jailing of its leaders. In the 1930s, California had 39 long-term labor and political prisoners, more than any other state. Elaine had helped organize and had participated in the defense of labor and political prisoners. She had participated in the 1934 waterfront strike, Salinas lettuce strike, lumber and gold strikes, the free speech fight in Los Angeles, and organized the unemployed during the Depression. She herself had been arrested 8 times on charges ranging from suspicion of criminal syndicalism, riot, refusing to move, and vagrancy, for which she had been fined $1,000. Twice she had been convicted on the vagrancy charge and on inciting riot. She appealed her cases, handled her own defense, and in jury trials won complete releases. To Elaine, this experience with her husband Carl made her all the more anxious to help the evacuees. Their son Tommy, namesake of Tom Mooney, who was framed and jailed following the Preparedness Day bombing in San Francisco, asked many pertinent questions about the barbed wire, watchtowers, sentries, and the searchlights that shot strong beams into the camp and through barracks windows. The washroom and the mess hall constituted our community centers for a long time. When we first arrived in Manzanar, small, single-seat privies were placed between blocks. These were built on sleds so that the drum receptacles could be emptied after trucks dragged the privies to a sewer hole. One morning a truck driver, who generally knocked on privy doors, forgot to do so. He tied a rope to the sled and started the vehicle. A feminine voice yelling from inside the privy attracted people from the rows of barracks, alarmed by the cry for help. Somewhere down the line the truck was flagged down and an old, gray-haired woman stepped out, extremely angry at the careless truck driver. Cruel and embarrassing experiences often resulted in a camp hurriedly put up, into which the government poured evacuees even before the limited facilities were installed. The people were highly indignant and embarrassed at such a situation as the one described above, but in public, they tried to pass it off as a joke. In the beginning, cooks in the public mess lacked essential cutlery. Once in a while, when frozen pork arrived, they let it thaw in the sun before cutting it. The result was devastating. From midnight on we rushed to the privies only to discover long lines of the afflicted ahead of us. Food was a problem. A great many of the evacuees were old rural farmers, and they could not stomach food prepared in bulk in the Western style. Weeks passed before farmers could enjoy food served in mess halls, and more weeks passed before food was prepared semi-Japanese style. The cooks had a difficult problem in satisfying the evacuees, for each person was allowed about 35 cents a day for food. It was the farmers who soon began planting vegetables in the fire breaks between the rows of barracks, and the vegetables supplemented food supplied by the government. In this crowded community, people had difficulties in adjusting themselves to the new situation. The older women, for instance, both from the cities and farms, never felt clean unless they bathed, Japanese style, in a tub filled with steaming water. So quite a number of them shunned the showers and relaxed comfortably in laundry tubs in the wash house. When this news got to the administration's ears, it caused excitement because officials thought the tubs might collapse. Posters prohibiting bathing in laundry tubs immediately went up everywhere. During this time, all kinds of signs went up prohibiting this and prohibiting that. Some did not make sense, while others did. Some signs were unheeded, like the ones which asked men and boys to refrain from making peeping holes in the fiberboard walls of women's shower rooms. Manzanar was a community of all types of people, from various economic classes, temporarily stripped of their former status. There were comedies, tragedies, happiness and sorrow. With almost no outside technical assistance, the people made it a functioning society. Our asset was a superabundance of trained personnel and inexperienced college graduates. The West Coast Nisei had plenty of education but little opportunity to use it in their fields of aspiration. Thus, college graduates had been truck drivers, soda jerks, farmers, and produce market clerks. Manzanar was a break for them in that they were able to apply and practice what they had learned in theory. It could be a perfect training ground, for white employers were not there to discriminate against them. A few white administrators sat at their desks to advise us. For the work we did, we received $8 a month for common labor, $12 a month for semi-skilled work, and $16 a month for professional services like those of doctors. Later, the wage scale was upgraded to $12, $16, and $19. Some of us worked with white teachers, doctors, and others, doing exactly the same thing for a mere fraction of the salaries they drew, because it seemed in the early months of the evacuation that we would be kept behind barbed wire for the duration. Nisei I talked to spoke of the need for small handicraft industries and agricultural projects at Manzanar. Others began asking these questions. Why couldn't we be employed outside the center after we had been cleared? We could make contributions to the war effort. We wanted union wages, as General DeWitt's Western Defense Council, which set up Manzanar, promised the early volunteers. The press had featured this news in such a way that it antagonized the white people against us. Actually, the volunteers received $2.67 for the first month, but this, of course, was not printed in the newspapers. The War Relocation Authority, WRA, a civilian agency, took over the administration of relocation centers from the Western Defense Command a couple of months after we settled in Manzanar. An administrator told me just about this time that the WRA was considering work projects for us. But the plan eventually fell through. Why? I asked the administrator. He said the white people in California and inland states did not want us to have productive communities. They opposed ownership or cultivation of land, even reclamation of waste land, not even to produce food for freedom. I asked him, no, they don't want you people to produce for the market. In other words, they don't want competition. Free enterprise had to be protected. This was the free enterprise system with its divide and rule employer policy that had fostered anti-Oriental sentiment against immigrants from the Far East. And this yellow peril propaganda of the past had laid the groundwork for the evacuation. Into Manzanar came the Los Angeles Times and the Hearst Los Angeles Examiner. They spewed anti-evacuee propaganda, and these were the only dailies we were able to get in camp. The Examiner frequently printed whole-page colored maps of the Pacific War front, showing Japanese victories. We saw groups of evacuees poring over these maps. Japanese victories combined with anti-evacuee hysteria being heightened by the press brought concern to many in camp. Some began asking, what if the Japanese landed on the west coast, even on a short raid? We would be starved out right here, said some. Others felt that we would be slaughtered by the military guards and additional troops brought to Manzanar. As the mode of living at Manzanar became more formalized, with the whole efforts of the people not taken to combating dust and wind and inconveniences of a crowded life, people began to look to the future and began to think what would happen if war came closer to our west coast. Numerous parents would go to the mess halls in the morning, and even if they were not fond of boxed cereals, they took their share anyway. These and other food they could preserve, they brought back to their barracks and stored away. Someday, when the government stopped giving us food, at least the children would have something to eat for a while, they said. The reactions of many of these evacuees were not unusual. Prior to evacuation, for instance, Attorney General Earl Warren, now Governor, later Chief Justice, U.S. Supreme Court, had read to the Tallinn Congressional Committee that it was not a mere coincidence that Japanese farmers lived in close proximity to strategic airfields, oil fields, military installations, and power lines. The fact is that by 1910 the main geographic pattern of the Japanese population in California had been set. The Japanese immigrants who arrived in California had limited opportunities and had settled wherever they could. Some inhospitable communities had burned down their shacks, and others had put the immigrants in boxcars with warnings never to return. The military installations, power lines, etc., came long after the Japanese had settled down in the area. They did not know that these areas would become strategic. A sickness of fear and suspicion took hold of numerous people in Manzanar Relocation Center. In April and May of 1942, when evacuees were crowded into the first relocation center, they sensed the presence of FBI informers among them. Many aliens, who were relieved because they had not been picked up by the FBI and separated from their families, feared that some Stulpijan might be writing letters to the FBI that they had been active in Japanese churches, language schools, fencing, and other organizations. And they expected FBI agents to reach into the barbed wire enclosure, pick them up, and herd them away. The fear of the FBI was paralyzing to the aliens in the early weeks of our concentration. This was particularly so to those who had rushed into Manzanar. expecting that prolonged stay in Los Angeles would inevitably result in their arrest. Thus, they were extremely cautious. Some of these men had been of some influence in the Japanese community in Los Angeles, and by arriving at Manzanar as pioneers, they conveniently became instruments through which the Caucasian administrators dealt with evacuees. They thus occupied important positions in the new community. The Caucasian administrators apparently believed that in using the pacifying influence of these former leaders of the Japanese community, they would be able to run the camp smoothly. Because criticism was directed against people of Japanese ancestry, Issei, as potentially subversive and pro-Japan, it seemed more logical that Nisei would be put in positions of importance. It was not that the aliens were anti-US, but the mere fact that the Nisei were running the camp would have been proper in counteracting anti-evacuee propaganda of the press. But as an assistant camp administrator told a few of us, "What the hell, you're all behind barbed wire anyway. It doesn't make any difference." This person was a tall and husky lawyer who soon earned the reputation of being able to out-talk anyone in camp, and he boasted and spread this information about himself. When the director, who formerly managed an Indian reservation, made a mistake, or the camp administration had to go back on its promises to us, which it often did, this assistant director bullied, cajoled, or argued 10,000 of us into accepting the administration's viewpoint. Lower down the echelon, the administrator's Caucasian staff had healthier attitudes toward us. In Block 10 where I lived, the great majority of the residents were from Terminal Island. They were fishing people, and the aliens had come from Wakayama in Japan, which is the native home of most of the immigrant fishermen on the west coast and in Hawaii. Because Terminal Island was classed as strategic, the people of Japanese ancestry were given 30 days to evacuate the area not too long after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. But one day the government issued an emergency order for them to clear out of their homes within 24 hours. Chaos followed, with families being forced to sell their possessions for almost nothing. This forced removal followed a pre-dawn FBI raid on the island's Japanese aliens, dramatized as almost all FBI raids are. This was indeed a reign of terror, and this is a mild statement. If the FBI agents had walked up to the homes of people, knocked on doors gently, and told aliens they were under arrest, the drama would have lacked headlines and hysteria-creating qualities. The wee hours of the morning apparently lend to imagination, with FBI agents yelling and pounding on doors, rushing into bedrooms, flashing badges and giving orders to frightened women and to crying, horrified children. This kind of behavior by G-men prevailed during the Palmer raids, and it is still a tactic of the FBI, particularly during periods of repression. Once done, it gets repeated by emboldened agents, until an aroused people put a stop to such conduct that flouts the constitutional rights of the people in their faces. In like manner, when Indians, who are the Native Americans, robbed of their land and pauperized, are kept in government custody in reservations, it is a step not far removed to put 110,000 people of common ancestry behind barbed wire. These are precedents that have robbed people of their rights and make it easier to take other similar steps. Thus, in January 1950, the Justice Department revealed that it has a program to put 21,105 people behind bars or in concentration camps, people who would be hauled into court for their thinking and tried for their ideas. Raymond P. Wardy, the acting Assistant Attorney General, said that the 21,105 include persons who are active members of the Communist Party and similar organizations, or who appear to be acting in concert with Russian interests. A sweeping and dangerous generalization, no different from the concentration of 110,000 people of Japanese ancestry in 1942, ostensibly for security reasons, alleging that we were potential saboteurs. In Manzanar of 1942, a person identified as an FBI stool pigeon was despised as a lowly creature. There was one person who told confidants he was keeping the FBI informed. One day he was sitting on the porch of a block leader's office. At that time, some evacuee laborers were delivering rolls of linoleum to the earlier occupied barracks, and they stopped to leave a few rolls at the block office. My longshoreman friend from San Francisco, Carl Yonda, was the block leader there, and he told me later that one of the men heaved a roll that crashed through the porch flooring, not quite reaching where the suspected FBI informer sat. My friend said this seemed deliberate, but the suspected person pretended not to notice the intention of the delivery man. Too often the temper and mood of large groupings of evacuees were ugly and unpredictable. A small incident would excite a whole barracks or even a block. We learned through letters from the Santa Anita Assembly Center that a riot took place there when evacuees became incensed at an FBI suspect. Shortly after my arrival, I worked on the Manzanar Free Press. A large staff of aspiring writers produced a weekly of 2 mimeographed sheets. One became exhausted trying to get an item in the paper with so many writing for it. Later on it became a 4-page tabloid, but by then I had left the staff. I worked as a laborer clearing sage brush and as a policeman. The police station was the center of almost all complaints, and we knew practically everything that went on in camp. Still later I became a police postal inspector, examining packages that came in.